Thanks. Well, it's good to be here with you. This little chart over here has nothing to do with the talk tonight, but that's basically a genealogy chart that goes all the way back to Adam, and I'd say almost everybody in this room could be tied to that chart. It goes back to the English kings, and they had a lot of kids, legally and illegally, and we all seem to tie back into their charts, and once you hit one of their charts, then it ties into everything else. But when I was a kid, I had no interest whatsoever in history because I thought, it has nothing to do with me. And then I found out, hey, we're all interconnected. We're all related to each other. And it just really changed my idea. I kind of got heavy into it a few years ago. My granddaughter, Alexis Snow, was running for Miss Washington County Queen Contest. And she asked me how many ancestors that she had that lived here in Washington County. And I wasn't into it much at that time. On her father's side is the Snow and the MacArthurs. And I knew I had some on mine. I said, oh, you got at least 20 ancestors that lived here in the county. But to me, that sounded like a lot. Well, because of her spunky personality and her good looks and that, she went on to win the Miss Washington County thing and competed well up to Salt Lake. But then later on, I got looking at the genealogy in that, and I found out that I personally had 64 ancestors that lived here in St. George. And my wife had 16 more. She had Joel Hills Johnson that lived in Ivans, not Ivans, Virgin. And then you had the Snow and the MacArthurs on top of that. So she had over 100 ancestors, not 20. And so that kind of got me into the genealogy a little bit more. And so when Kelly got talking about giving a talk and whatnot, and I thought, well, I could talk about the various ancestors that came here to the area, because I had ancestors in every group. You had the missionaries that came. And Jacob Hamblin was my ancestor that came in that group. And following them was the Swiss immigrants that settled in Santa Clara. Some of them spun over the Toblers now, wound up here in Washington. And I had Johannes or John Reber that came from that group. And then you had your regular 300 families was called to St. George. Whenever I was thinking 300 families, I'm thinking that's like 700 or 800 people. They had probably 6 people at least in every family, times 3, that's 1,800 people that came down to settle St. George at that time. And I had James Bennett Bracken and Eli Whipple and a few others that came down during that time period. And then I had Samuel Adams that came down shortly after that. So you had the 4 groups, the Missionaries, the Swiss for Santa Clara, and then the St. George group, and then a few people that came right after that. And so I kind of selected those individuals to talk about tonight and some of the stories that they had, and the uniqueness of what brought them here and why they were here. I wrote it down because I didn't want to miss things, but I'm hoping that I can talk about it, because reading something, it kind of loses your attention as it goes along. So hopefully I'll just use this as a reminder as I kind of go along and can talk about the different things. Wanted to begin with Jacob Hamblin's family. Jacob's family actually came into America in the 1640s when they had what was called the Great Migration that came from England. You had the king that was deposed about that time. They chopped off his head, and the Parliament took over for a period of time, and a lot of people left there and came to the Americas during that time period. And that's when his family came here. They later went to Philadelphia area, and then later out in the Ohio area. And his family in the 1830s, I guess it would have been, wound up going into Wisconsin. They were some of the very first settlers in the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin kind of became a little bit popular during our last election. It was one of those swing states that made the determination who the president was. While Jacob Hamblin was living there in Wisconsin, the missionaries came along and he got converted. And he told his wife that he was going to get baptized, and when she did that, this was a lot of anti-feelings going around at that time, and she told him, well, if you plan on getting baptized, don't plan on living with me after that. And his father kind of had that same attitude, and so as he was going to where he was going to be baptized, he was thinking about all of those things, and it kind of made him wonder if he was doing the right thing. And about that time, he says a personage came to him, and he thought it was his grandfather. And his grandfather told him that if he would go on and continue on and be baptized, that he couldn't comprehend the things that would happen to him through accepting the gospel. And if you know anything about Jacob Hamblin, you can see that that is what happened to him too. Shortly after that, he was called as a missionary preacher for Joseph Smith when Joseph was running for president of the United States. And so he was stomping in back at the western or the eastern states at that time when Joseph Smith was killed. And it was interesting that he said the day that Joseph Smith was killed, that all of the missionaries just felt depressed and didn't know what was happening, but just was very, very depressed. Later they found out that on that day was when Joseph was killed. He then went back to Nauvoo and arrived there just a day or so before the famous meeting was held with Brigham Young, and Rigdon was trying to say, I need to be the president of the church now, and he was a great guy. He had a wonderful speaking ability and everything else. But Brigham Young got up after he spoke and says, I'll conduct this meeting. And the way he talked and his mannerisms and everything else, the people in the audience could hear the voice of Joseph Smith. Even the little whistle that he had to, because his tooth was broken, was there with Brigham Young. And Jacob actually stood up in that meeting and says, that is the voice of the prophet. So he was one of those you hear that stood up and declared that at that time. He was in the militia at the time that they had to protect the city, and later was left when everybody else did, and lived for from 1845 to 1850 mostly in the state of Ohio. One of the stories that I thought was interesting while he was in the state of Ohio was he got in this kind of an old rundown house. It's kind of hard to believe they had rundown houses at that time because they're just barely building them. But he got sick, and he had asked for his wife and children to come, and they came, and they wound up getting sick the very next day. And so he and his whole family was laying there sick, and he couldn't even get up enough to go get some water. And he tried, but he couldn't do it. And a minister came by and told him, look, if you guys will deny the Mormon faith, he says, I've got water and chickens and everything else you want, and I'll take care of you. And he says, no, I won't do that. And so the minister just walked off and left him there, dying of thirst. And at that point, he had a prayer and asked the Lord to please help him out in their dire circumstances. And about 2 hours goes by, and William Johnson, who had been working out in the fields all day long and came home and was laying, just getting ready to go to bed, felt impressed to get up and go get some water and bring it over to them. And he felt like that this was an answer to his prayer, which it certainly was. And then what I thought was really interesting, he says the next day, the quail came out of the bushes and they was easily caught. And he says he later learned that all of the other camps of the saints around, the same thing happened to them. And that kind of reminded me of Moses when they were walking the children of Israel through the wilderness, and how the quail came out and fed the people at that time. So the Lord is the same yesterday, today, and forever in the way that he takes care of us. Another story of Jacob Hamblin on the way to Salt Lake. He was driving, and his wife had left him at this point, given him the 4 kids. The youngest is only 18 months old. And he's driving a wagon. His mother had been helping him, and she just passed away a few days prior. So he's there with the kids and his father. And he had had a dream the night before, and as he drove into this little town, he noticed this house that he had had in his dream. And in the dream, there was this lady that he was supposed to go ask to marry. And so he went up on the door and knocked on the door, and the lady by the name of Rachel Judd came to the door, and the story goes that he introduced himself, and she invited him in, and his first thing out of his mouth is, "I'm Jacob Hamblin, I'm here to ask you to be my bride." And she says, "Well, I'll marry you, but I need you to know that we can't have children." And the reason was because she'd been married before for a few years and they'd not been able to conceive any children. And he looked at her and says, "Your name is Rachel, my name is Jacob. We will have 2 sons and we'll name them Joseph and Benjamin," which they did. And I descend out of Benjamin. And so that was their wedding proposal, and it says that they went that day and went down and found the judge and got married that day, and then he lived there for a period of time because it was too late in the season to come west. Whether they got married that day or not, it's an interesting story. She's also the same one that's now buried in Santa Clara, along with Jacob's father. They were some of the first ones that's buried there in the Santa Clara Cemetery. Jacob's father died in 1856 and was buried there, so they only got here in about 1854. So. There was a couple of stories about Jacob after he got here that I thought was interesting. Make sure I get that. Now we got through 4 pages already. One last little thing, as they were finally leaving Rachel's house and headed out here, cholera at that time hit a lot of the various different wagon trains. And Jacob felt that it was going to hit their family. It had just started to come into the camp and people were starting to die of it, and he mentioned to his wife that our family's going to be attacked by this, but if we'll rely on the Lord, we'll be okay. And she kind of felt like it was the wrong thing to tell the children that cholera was going to attack them because they'd be more receptive to receive it. But he says, no, it's going to happen, and just we need to rely on the Lord. And about a day or so later, he was coming back from burying somebody, and as he came into the house, Rachel wound up getting attacked with this, and it came on her quickly, and she exclaimed, "Oh Lord, I'm going to die, help me." And he immediately anointed her with consecrated oil and gave her a blessing, and she was immediately healed. And the next day, Jacob was attacked, and his father gave him a blessing, and he was healed. And then he was told to ride in the wagon, so his little 12-year-old son took the reins and started to drive the wagon, but it jerked and pulled him forward, and the little boy fell underneath the wagon wheel, and the front wheels of the wagon ran over him. And Jacob looked at him and thought, he's never going to breathe again. And his father Jacob's father took him out of the way and gave him a blessing. And the young boy jumped up and says, "I'm okay." He was healed that quickly by being run over with a heavy wagon. So I thought that the reason I'm telling you those kind of stories is to show you the kind of faith that they had, what they had to rely upon, and what brought them here. And it seemed like all of these people went through those same kind of things. When Jacob finally came here to this area, he wound up getting the grazing rights for Mountain Meadows. And so the Mountain Meadow Massacre later actually took place. He got that in 1856, and it was the next year in 1857, on September 11th, is when the Mountain Meadow Massacre took place. Any other thing that's happened on 9/11? Isn't that interesting that those would be the same days? There was another little incident. That was the one in the talk, but just remembered, like I said, I got all this stupid information that's useless. But at the time that the king got killed and the Parliament took over, they invaded Ireland. And on 9/11, they went over and invaded this one town and took this town after a siege. But on 9/11, this town finally surrendered, and they took the entire population, men, women, and children, and killed them. And then they went to the next town and says, "Okay, if you don't surrender, the same thing will happen to you. And all of Ireland surrendered at that point. But that's just incredible. But it's interesting that was on the same date. Jacob, right after he got those rights, wound up in the Santa Clara area. They'd built a dam, and I don't know which dam it was. It may have been the one a little north of Gunlock area. But they built a dam at that time so that they could have water for the crops. And the Indians were really skeptical of coming and helping building the dam because they just didn't think there was going to get any rain. And they just finished the dam, watered the crops one time, and then nothing. And the Indian chief came to him and says, look, you told us if we'd build this dam it would have rain. Now we have no water for our crops. What are we going to feed our children on? We used to have rabbits. Now there's no rabbits. What are we going to do? And Jacob said, it didn't say a whole lot. And the chief says, look, we got one medicine man. We'll ask him to go to the mountain, meaning Pine Valley, and pray and try to get rain. And you do the same. You go ask your God if he gets some rain. And maybe we'll be okay. And Jacob was really impressed with the faith that this Indian chief had in him to be able to do that. And so Jacob actually did the next morning, got up and went up in the Pine Valley there, and there's some other Indians that kind of went with him, and then he kind of went off by himself and had a prayer. And while he was praying, to ask the Lord, he said, look, if I was wrong in telling the Indians that they had to have water for the crops, please forgive me, but help us out here. Basically, I'm paraphrasing a little bit there. And while he was giving the prayer, he felt 3 little raindrops land on his back, and it was a clear sky at that time, so he felt like that was a sign that they would get rain. And so he got up, and the Indians with him, he told them, we'll have rain. And then he went back to the people and told them that the rain was going to come. And the next day it started to rain. And the interesting thing with that particular rainstorm, instead of a gusher coming down and the creeks getting all muddy, it came down in such a way that the creeks were clear, and it gave them enough water that they was able to water the crops for the rest of the entire season. And he says that they got more corn and goods from that particular season of growing stuff than he could ever remember after that. So it's interesting how the Lord actually did help the people out in their times of need. And because of those kind of experiences, it gave those early Mormon missionaries a good relationship with the Indians. And with just Jacob Hamblin himself, I could go on all night and talk about him and the various different experiences they had. I did want to bring up a little bit about his brother. We hear so much about Jacob Hamblin, but we don't hear much about the rest of the family. Jacob had 11 other brothers and sisters, and some of them came down here in the area. William Bracken was one of them, or William Hamblin was one of them that was down in this area. He got the name of Gunlock Hamblin. And the reason he got the name of Gunlock Hamblin, some of you may have heard this story, but he got in a rifle shooting contest out to Pipe Springs. It wasn't called Pipe Springs at that time, but it was in that area. And in the contest, they were shooting different things, and finally somebody got a pipe, a smoking pipe, and I don't know if they held it out or whatever they did, but he shot the bowl out of the bottom of the pipe and won the contest because nobody else could do that. And that gave Pipe Springs its name. It was named after that particular incident and that shooting thing. And he got the nickname of Gunlock Hamblin because of his shooting ability. And so he was the first settler in what's now called Gunlock. And about a year after he'd moved there, George Albert Smith came down and was visiting with them there at one time and asked him, well, what do you call this place? He says, well, it hasn't got a name yet. And he says, well, let me name it. We'll call it Gunlock, and naming it after his nickname. So that's how Gunlock got its name and how Pipe Spring got its name. So interesting, this Gunlock Hamblin wound up just a few years later befriending an Indian by the name of Moroni. Now I thought that was kind of crazy because here he's named Moroni, but he was named Moroni before the Mormons ever got out here. So I always thought that was a unique Book of Mormon name, but evidently the Indians were named that out here. But this Indian befriended him, and one day brought this shiny piece of rock to him, piece of gold. And finally, he wouldn't tell him where it was because the Indian's father told him, don't ever tell the white people where this is because they'll take the land and we'll lose everything. And finally he was able to get out of him where it was, and the Indian took him to where it was, and they dug down and found a vein of gold at that point. And later other people heard about it and tried to take it away from them, and eventually, I think 2 years later, a group came down and actually went into partnership with them at that point, and then eventually bought the rights for the mine. It became a big famous gold mine in Nevada. And what was interesting is about 5 years later, well, it was about 6 years, the Indians kind of stirred up things because it was creating problems between the whites and the Indians. And finally the whites got the upper hand and took it back over, but they needed to prove ownership for it, and so Gunlock Hamblin was asked to go to Pioche and testify in a court hearing there. And his wife had told him, please don't drink or eat anything from any public establishment. Things are bad now, but they were bad then too. But he was sipping coffee in one of the restaurants there, and after a few minutes, all of a sudden he stood up and says, I've been poisoned, and fell over, and he wound up dying at that point. So he actually got poisoned. That's how he died. And so as bad as things are today, they're just as bad back in those days. You know, we think Mountain Meadow Massacre, that should have never happened, but the times of the time, you had the Johnson's Army coming from back east here. Brigham Young actually wrote a letter to Jacob Hamblin and says that the Army's coming out here, all things are great, and tried to overlook it a little bit, but they were very nervous. They'd actually had some of the apostles come down here in the area just before the Mountain Meadow Massacre and told the people here to please be aware that all these things are happening, and you guys need to be the people down here to take care of this end of the state. And so they had that kind of a mindset. And so when Jacob Hamblin was going towards Salt Lake, this immigrant group was actually coming down this way. And they actually met and talked overnight, and Jacob actually suggested that they go to his place and have pasturing there. And they continued on down, but then they started, some of them, not all of them, but a few of the group started causing little problems and everything, and were not behaving in the way they should have been. So by the time they got down there, they got a pretty bad reputation. They were bragging how they were going to go to California and get people and come back and take them over and all that kind of stuff. And it really made the people nervous here. And because the apostles had come down here and told them that to not sell anything to anybody, to be ready to go into the hills because we might have to do that, all that kind of created an environment. And then these people that were coming, some of them was known individuals that was in the mob that killed Joseph Smith. So you had all of this environment that is there, no communication back and forth. You had Jacob Hamblin took the leaders of the Indians the main leaders, to Salt Lake to meet Brigham Young at that point. And so they were in Salt Lake when all this was taking place. There was a writer that was sent to Salt Lake to ask him what to do, and he got there a couple of days before everything took place. But by the time he got back down here, Brigham Young had told him to let him go on. By the time they got back down here, it had already happened. The interesting thing that very few people know is that there was another wagon train that was a little further down past Mesquite, that at the same time the Indians were surrounding them and going to wipe them out also. And word got to Jacob Hamblin as he was coming down that this was taking place, and so he sent riders on to that wagon train and was actually able to stop the thing there. The Indians wound up taking all the loose stock and everything from them, which Jacob Hamblin later on tried to get back and return back to them, but he kept them from being killed. Nothing's ever said about that one because nothing ever happened. So it wasn't something that should have been taking place. It wasn't under the leadership of the church. It was under leadership of the militia, and they thought that they were doing what was right. And poor John D. Lee is the one that really got blamed for everything, and he was just basically following the orders from those above him. And that's another talk that could go on for a couple hours. That at this time, and go on to probably, let's go to Switzerland, the Swiss. Time goes in a hurry. The Swiss were a wonderful bunch of people. Johannes Reber was a young man of about 30 years of age when the missionaries wound up going to his town. His wife was a Stukie, and her mother had actually had a dream a few years prior to that at some point there was going to be some missionaries come from the east and teach them about the gospel, and that they should join the church at that time. She says, I won't be alive when it happens, but I want all of you to be aware of it. And she had passed away at this point, and Johannes had actually got rheumatoid arthritis where his hands had all crippled up, his back had hunched over, and I don't know if you've ever seen anybody had a hump on their back. He got a hump on his back. He was only 30 years of age. Had to walk with 2 sticks for 2 or 3 years at this point. And the missionaries, when they came there, they were some of the very first ones that wound up being converted. And it was in the winter time. And when they were going to go baptize, and there's 4 or 5 other people and them that was going to be baptized, they actually had to carry him about 1.5 miles. 1.5 miles is in St. George from Black Ridge to the Black Ridge. They had to carry him that far to where the water was, and they had to take axes with them to break the ice to make a hole where they had some water that they could bury him in this ice water. And we got it pretty easy when we get baptized. And they baptized everybody, and he was the last one to be baptized, and they helped him out of the water and then confirmed him and gave him a blessing of health at that point. And as they finished it up, the other guy was going to help walk him back, and he says, no, I think I can make it on my own. Threw away his sticks and walked back. And this Stukie kid, John Stukie, is actually one of the stories that I got from that. Was telling the story of it. And he said the next day he was a brother to the wife. The next day he went to, a couple of days later, he went to visit there, and he seen this man come out of the house, was walking straight and everything else. He thought it was somebody else. As he got up closer, he recognized that it was Johannes Reber. And he was just totally taken back. And because of that miracle, that's why so many of the saints at that time joined the church, and it was those people are the ones that wound up coming across and winding up in Santa Clara. John also here had a little article in one of the Ensigns here a few months back telling the story of how it was when they were crossing the plains and on those hand carts that they was on rations at one point. And at one point they shot one of the buffaloes and they distributed a piece of meat to all of the different families. And they was holding it until Sunday to have it for a Sunday meal. And he was so hungry, he had a little pocket knife, and as he's going along, he'd cut off a chunk of it and eat it, and then the next day he'd cut off another chunk. So quite a bit of it was gone by the time they come to the Sunday meal. And when the father opened it up to get the meat out, and probably about half of it was gone at that point, he was expecting to get scolded. But instead of being scolded, his father just sat down and cried, recognizing how hungry the kids were and how inadequate they were to take care of them. They continued on, came to Santa Clara. They were just a few days ahead of the 300 families that was coming down here to St. George. And they arrived here at the end of November. They had about a month before the rain started here. I always thought that the rainstorm that caused the flood in 1861 was a local flood. But got on the internet today and just happened to, I was trying to find exact dating of all that, and it all of a sudden popped up that in 1861 the whole western area here was flooded. In Oregon and California and all the states through here, they recorded more flooding and rain than any time since in recorded history. And so it wasn't just here a local thing, it was quite a major thing. But that flood wound up washing away the fort there in Santa Clara and all of their trees and equipment and everything else they had. And a little comment was made that when it finally got through, that the settlers that had gotten here before and the poor Swiss saints that got here were now equally poor. Nobody had anything because everything got washed away. There was a couple of interesting little stories of Johannes Reber wound up later marrying one of the Graf children, or she was a child practically, probably 16 or so at the time they got married. He was probably 35. A lot of that happened. It's interesting, the Tullis family that I also come from, that was the foreman that told the people at Mountain Meadows that they could go there and stay. He had a family move in with him, the Eccles family, and the father, and they were all in the, what was the group that got caught in the winters and handcart company about starved to death? Martin Willie Handcart Company. They were in that particular group. And he wound up not dying during that, but he got a cold and died about 2 years later. So you talk about the deaths that happened there, but there was a lot of other deaths and things that took place later on with people. But it left a wife that was about 12 years older than Tullis at that point, and then a couple younger daughters that was about 10 years younger than him. He wound up marrying the mother, and then about 4 or 5 years later wound up also marrying one of the daughters, and had one son by the mother, and I think 10 or 12 kids by the daughter. And interestingly, most of you know Les Cephas. Les comes from the son of the mother. I come through the daughter. And so it's amazing how you get back in this genealogy and we're all connected back and forth so much. There's a little story of that I wanted to read about it. This Julia Graf talked in her journal that when she was about 5 years of age, she says that foodstuff was scarce in those early years, and it seems that we children were always hungry. Bread was made from bran and shorts or corn or anything. Baking was done in a small Dutch oven by putting coals under and over it. We like Dutch oven cooking, but that was the only thing they had. Our bread was rationed, 2 small slices per meal. We children were good to forage. We'd eat wild cabbage, stalks, sour dock stalks, acorn bulbs, tender young willows, strawberries, poutberries. One day we 3 children got a loaf of bread and a knife and took it to Mother, who was working in the garden, and begged for bread. She knew we were hungry, and she sat down and cried and said someday she would give us a piece of bread all around the loaf with maybe even butter on it. It's just amazing what they've gone through and how good we've had it in our life because of what they have done for us. This John Stuckey again gives another little story talking about when he was a young kid that they had to go without shoes for many number of years. And he says in the wintertime, they'd have to go out and get the cow because the cows would have to forage for their own food. And he'd have to go get the cow and cross the waters and everything. And sometimes he said you could see his footsteps, but you could tell where they was by the blood in the footsteps because of the ice and coldness of that on his feet. And in the summertime, he'd have to run from bush to bush to keep from burning his feet because they had no shoes at all. One last summary. It says that they worked hard, lived frugally, and 11 years later, in 1873, James G. Bleak reported the Santa Clara settlement, consisting of 20 families, 12 of which are Swiss, and were sent there by the Perpetual Immigration Fund without a dollar, now have houses, land, vineyards, and wagons. And they were able to make their donations and not use any of the funds. All the donations were sent to St. George, and he reported there's being no poor in Santa Clara at that point. So they were very, very frugal and worked. But can you imagine going from the Swiss Alps, where it's so beautiful and green, and coming here to the desert area here? Amongst the people that came here, one of the Cannon families, I believe it was, the mother there was just so depressed because this area was so bleak, and her husband asked her, well, can't you just put up with it? She said, well, if there was just one thing of beauty, even one thing of beauty here, I could do it, but there isn't even one thing. And later, her husband wound up running across the sago lily in bloom and dug it up and brought it to her. And because of that, she was able to stay here because she found one thing of beauty. Going on into the James Bennett Bracken family, the Brackens actually came to the Americas in 1699, and they wound up landing in Delaware. And recently in my reading of the Book of Mormon, trying to figure out where the land of the Nephites was, where the story took place, I found that it's in the Delaware, Maryland area. Nobody's ever picked up on that. I found one BYU student that wrote an article on that and indicating that's where it was. But I've taken over 900 references out of the Book of Mormon, giving descriptions of cities from one place to the other, and wilderness areas and seas and all these different things. And that 900 references, there's not one of them that doesn't match that area. It's an island, top is a narrow neck of land with the sea on the east, the sea on the west, down the coast on the other sides, all these cities. The Patuxent Rivers, the River Sidon, with more cities on the east coast and the west coast. And I've taken over 40 different cities and put them in relationship to each other. And not one reference is out of place. And it was interesting that the Brackens wound up landing right there in Delaware, within 50 miles of where City of Desolation and Bountiful was, and lived for 3 generations right there, and then moved on out to the west eventually. They were actually in Ohio about 100 and some odd years later, and wound up being converted to the church. March 1832 is when they were baptized, and then they wound up going to Missouri. And we're luckily to be there during 1833 when the Saints were driven out of Jackson County, and then luckily again 5 years later driven out of the whole state. James Bennett Bracken's first wife was just a young teenage gal, about 17 years old. He was about 19, and through that persecution it made her sick and she died. He wound up remarrying again a couple of years later to Eli Whipple's daughter, and they eventually all wound up here in St. George. I guess it was Sarah Heads, and then they had a daughter, and his son married him. All these Brackens are the same names. A couple of the stories that I found interesting with the Brackens was, I don't know if any of you remember, at one point Joseph Smith took a bunch of people to where Adam-on-de Ammon is, and pointed out that this is the altar of Adam and this is the valley of Adam. And it was James Bennett Bracken was one of the 2 or 3 people that was there and wrote it in his journal, and that's actually what church history is, where they get it out, is his journal out of that particular statement. Another story that I thought was interesting is later on there was a mob coming from one of the towns near Missouri, not Missouri, Nauvoo, and several hundred mobsters was coming to destroy Nauvoo. And Joseph gathered up about 80 men, and James Bennett Bracken Sr. was one of those individuals, and they rode out with him on this hill. And then Joseph had them stationed about a rod apart, or 16.5 feet apart, in rows up on this hill. And so when the mob came across the river, they looked up and seen all these Mormons up on the hill. There's only 80 of them up there, but they looked and talked with each other, and there's several hundred of them. They talked, and then all of a sudden they turned around and rode away. And a few days later, James was over to this town where the mobsters came from, and one of the mobsters came up to him and says, "How many of you GD Mormons was up on that hill that day?" And he says, "There's 80 of us." And he says, "Well, that's another one of your GD Mormon lies then." He says, "We've seen thousands of you up there." And so there's angels in between each of those as they were stationed across there. And so I thought that was a kind of an interesting story. The Brackens wound up coming to Utah. Levi, the father of the group, in his 60s, wound up getting cholera and dying on the way. James and his young son, it was about 7 at that time, made it to Payson area, and then they were called to Dixie, came down here with the 300 families, was here in St. George about 2 years, and then went to Pine Valley. And also the Eli Whipple family went to Pineville. That's how their kids wound up meeting, because they was living there together. And they built sawmills there. And some of the lumber in the tabernacle and the temple and that came from that area. We always heard about coming from Mount Trumbull, but it came from both of those places. Shortly after they established a shingle mill on one of the creeks up there, one day they heard this noise come. It sounded like a huge wind, and all of a sudden they seen a flood coming down. And he sent his boy down running as fast as he could to warn everybody, but the flood went faster. And at the Bracken family, the mother heard it and thought it was a tornado or something. And so she had all of the kids and everybody come out, and they had taken a wagon box and taken the wheels off and set it on the ground there. And so they all climbed in that and pulled the tarp over and was holding it down. And finally one of the kids peeked out and noticed this flood coming down, and it was right up to the box at that point, and she screamed, and then everybody ran out to the box, and the little boy Sal, that was about 6 or 7 years of age, as he was running along, thumped his toe on the rock and hollered out, "Damn!" And his mother stopped and scolded him. And here they're running from the flood, and he stopped. So that's the kind of people they were, you know. Anyway, that flood continued on, and there's another family down below that it hit them and wound up drowning some of the kids, and it wound up destroying all the houses and everything that had been built along that. Those are just between the Santa Clara floods and the Virgin River floods and the Pine Valley floods. Those are some of the things that they had to contend with. It kind of brings us into the last individual, and that's Samuel Adams. The Adams family's some of those that you know here in the area. George knows them quite well. Samuel Adams was about 15 years of age. His mother died. His dad put him out as an apprenticeship as a silversmith when he was 15, and he wound up meeting the Mormon missionaries during that time period, got converted to the church, went on a mission in England at 17 years of age. There's this young kid, hardly reads and writes, going on a mission, doesn't know anything. Had some wonderful experiences. If we had time, I'd tell you those, but we don't have enough time for that. But after the mission, at 19, he comes back to Liverpool and wants to migrate to the Americas to be with the saints. And in talking with the guy in charge at that time, the guy says, well, if you was married, you'd have a better chance. I said, anybody you know in the branch that you get married to? And he said, well, there's one girl I kind of like, and mentioned to her who it was, is Emma Jackson. He says, well, she'll be coming walking by here in a little while. Why don't you just wait here, and when she comes by, you can ask her. And so she comes walking by in a little while, and the bishop invites her in, and he makes a proposal, and she accepts, and he marries him, and they get on the boat that night and come to America. Can you believe that? Those are the kind of people that we have to find. You'd have to have a lot of faith with that. They came to Salt Lake, lived there for a period of time. Brigham Young, I think, actually took them under the wing for a little. Some of the wives took them under the wings and helped them out. They had some little twins at that point, little twin girls. Some other kids that they finally eventually wound up coming here to St. George by 1865. And was living here. He wound up being a blacksmith, and he did all of the tool sharpening for the tools that's used for the rock on the tabernacle and the temple and the courthouse and all the different places in the area there. The story that I wanted to share you with concerning him, two little things. One of them, his oldest daughter wound up marrying the McFarland that wrote the song "Far, Far Away." That's our St. George, I call it our St. George Christmas song, because it was written here in St. George. And so they were living here, and about a year after they'd been here, diphtheria hit the area. And they wound up losing their little 3-month-old baby and a 2-year-old son within just 24 hours. 2 of the children died. And it just really hit the mother strong. You can imagine how that would affect you. And Erastus Snow was the next door neighbor, and he'd come over and visit with them every once in a while. And one day she was just so depressed, and he basically told her, look, if you don't overcome this and let this go, your children's not going to have a mother to continue to raise them. She said, oh, if I just knew where they were, to me they're just gone. And if I just knew what was happening, where they were. And he gave her a promise that if she would let it go for now, that the Lord would allow her to know where her children was. And so she kind of eased up on it a little bit and took comfort in that. And a few weeks later, they were all out on the porch in the evening, and she asked the older daughter, the 12-year-old, to go in the house and get some knitting stuff and bring it back out. And a little while later, the daughter came out and says, oh, Mother, I can't tell you what happened to me. And then she went on that way for the rest of the night, and then the next morning, finally, she told him the story of what had happened. And she said as she went in the room to get the stuff, there's this lady standing in there, and there's 3 children with her. She said she recognized the 2 of them as her little brother and sister that had recently passed. The little baby and the little boy was standing next to her, but she says the lady also had another child in its arm that I didn't recognize. And she described it to her, and her mother says, well, you wouldn't have known it. That was your twin sister that had died previously when you was just a few months old. And then she described the lady that was holding the children, and she described it in such a detail that she recognized that it was her cousin that had joined the church in England with her that had passed away. And that was who was taking care of her children at this point. And then later, she had a dream where her mother came to her, and her mother indicated that it was Emma that was taking care of them, and that she was with her people, she called it. And she said, well, Mother, can't you go visit with him? She says, no, I can't. But it's sometime in the near future, a way will be provided that I'll be able to. Now, this was in 1865. The temple wasn't dedicated until 1877. So when that happened, then baptism for the dead and all that could be placed, and she could go and be with her at that point. It's interesting how all these dreams, all these stories fit together with the truth. There's interesting how it all fits together. I better summarize it up. A modern day story that kind of shows that we still have the spirit of Dixie here. I don't know how many of you know Dave Thompson or knew Rex Sylvester. Dave Thompson.
Dave Thompson.
Yeah. They was living in the 26th Ward a number of years ago, and they had been over to Hurricane, the picking peaches over there, on their way back, and wound up having a head-on collision. Rex and one of his grandsons was killed. Dave technically was killed, but his neck and his spinal column there was separated. It's kind of like a decapitation, and normally you get killed from that at the worst, or at the best, you're paralyzed. But Dave, the paramedics came along and put a neck brace on him, and Dave says that while they were putting that on, he was watching them from above, putting that on out of a body experience. And while he was in Salt Lake at the hospital up there, Rex Sylvester actually came to him and told him that not to worry, that he was going to be okay. We down here in St. George, word we got that he was going to live, but he's going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And so my son-in-law, Scott Sullivan, got with me one day. Scott had a key to the house that he was given to kind of take care of things. They were good friends of them at that point. I wound up selling my house to Holly, my daughter Holly and Scott. And so they got to know the Thompsons very well. And anyway, we went down to the house to see what we could do to make it wheelchair accessible. And as we went through the house, the way the halls were made, everything, there's just no way it was possible to make that wheelchair accessible. And so Scott conceived with the idea of tearing the house down and rebuilding it, and through a community effort. And so he went around to several subcontractors and materials people and got commitments to donate material and labor to rebuild the house. And even the city of St. George participated with some of the costs, and the school next door, they had some little fundraisers and that participated. And they wound up tearing that house completely down and rebuilding it in 30 days. Now that's a miracle in itself, especially in today's economy. But what was interesting is when Dave finally wound up coming to town, all of the people that had helped provide that house and the school teachers and a bunch of other people were there waiting for them. And it was a fun thing. But what was really fun is Dave was able to actually get up and walk into the house. True to the commitment of Rick's telling him that he would be okay. It was more than just, you're going to live. He was okay. And he was continued on where he got well enough that he was able to go back to Dixie Glass and work there for a few years again. So I just want you to know that I know that God lives, that Jesus is the Christ. He is involved with all of these people. He's involved with our lives today. I remember when I was 20, I gave a prayer at that time. I was inactive in the church. I wanted to know whether there's a God or not. I had no clue whether there's anything in that regard. I thought, how in the world am I going to find out? And I thought, well, if I went on a mission, I could find out real fast. And if it was true, I'd be in the right place. If it wasn't, I could just come home. And so I went to my bishop and asked him if I could go on a mission. And about 3 months later, I found myself dragging a suitcase across Temple Square there, where they had the mission home at that point. And about the middle of the week, they only kept you there a week at that time. Now here's this inactive kid going on a mission, 1 week's training to be sent out. In the middle of that week, I wound up going to a doctor's appointment, and as I was walking in front of the church office buildings there, back in those days, there was hardly any traffic on the sidewalks, let alone the streets. And all of a sudden I felt the presence of people walking towards me, so I looked up, and there was David O. McKay and his 2 counselors helping him walk down the sidewalk. And so I just stopped and stood there, and as they walked by, the Spirit whispered, "He is a prophet." And from that point on, my testimony started growing. I had an experience here in the St. George Temple. I'm going to have to tell it very briefly. But here in June the 4th of 2011, I was there acting as assistant shift coordinator, and I was trying to get some people from one shift to stay over to the other shift to help us on the veil as they went through, because it was going to be a very big veil as people getting married and just a lot of extra people there, and we didn't have enough workers. So I was going back and forth, made arrangements, just coming back to tell everybody that arrangements had been made, and then they just was letting some people come out of the room I needed to go into. So I stopped there as they were coming out, and I looked up the hall, it's about here to where the camera is, and seen this Brother Theobald standing there, Merlin Theobald. And I thought, what's Merlin doing here? Because I'm looking for workers. He's not on my substitute list. I'm keeping the role. I was the one that's in charge of the role, but he wasn't there, and so he's there, but he shouldn't be. And so that thought ran across my mind. And I looked back and forth, and then he leaves. When I look up, he's gone anyway, and then I didn't see him the rest of the day, didn't think anything more of it. I went to my shift Monday, and that's the shift that he normally works on. And they're making their announcement that says, by the way, Brother Theobald passed away last Saturday morning. He had passed away, I found out, at the hospital 17 minutes before I seen him standing there in the hallway. Now, that particular story has a whole bunch more to go with it, but here's the weirdest thing, and I still can't really believe it, but I have to believe it. Most of you have heard of deja vu and these things, how you kind of get a little glimpse of something that happened, and now we're rerunning it again. I've spent about 20,000 hours searching out the birthday of the Savior and various different things about the church. And about that time it was about 12,000 hours, and I'd come up with the birthday of the Savior and everything at that point. And to do that, I had to learn to read the moon, because the calendar that they use is the lunar calendar. So you have to understand that to find the right days and make everything work. And I got thinking, I had always wondered when it was that I'd had the little prayer wondering about whether the church was true or not. And I thought it was the end of May or first part of June, but I was thinking it was closer to the end of May, but I didn't have an idea. I remember seeing the moon. It was about 11 o'clock, just after dark, not quite a full moon, which now I understand is the 11th day of the month. And I thought, I can go back and look back at the time, find out when the 11th day of the month was, and find out the day that was. So I got up about 2 o'clock in the morning. I was thinking this, and I got up and turned on the computer, looked up that date, and it wound up being June the 4th. This vision I seen with Brother Theobald all these years later was on June the 4th. How in the world? Also, you would have to have some conniving on the other side, juggling, to work with Brother Theobald to make the timing work. And I found from his side that basically he had asked his children to come to him, and he'd kind of testified almost individually to them how important the gospel was to him, and how important the temple was to him, and how it should be to them. And me seeing him there right after he'd passed away and telling them about it was like a second witness that what he was telling them was true. And then for me to have this, I'm into the numbers. And as I was telling Kelly the other day what the numbers was, it was 17 minutes. I didn't have a clue of what time it was, but when they had announced this on Monday morning, in my mind was inserted the idea of what time did you see him? And so I started trying to research that. And I thought, well, they just barely dismissed those brethren to leave that room right when I seen him there. So I went to the individual that had dismissed them and said, did you happen to look at the clock? And he said, yeah, I did. And he told me it was 11:27 that he had seen on the clock. And then I went to the funeral, and Ed and Merlin's widow wound up looking on the death certificate to find the time that he died. And it was 11:10. So that gave us 17 minutes. Now, that doesn't mean anything to anybody, but to me, because I'm into the numbers and all this, the Savior was born on the 11th day of the month, died on the 14th, and was resurrected on the 17th. So 17 is the number of his resurrection. 11:27 to the end of the hour is 33 minutes. The life of the Savior was 33 years. And the first part of the hour, if you go to the Hebrew hour on the sundial, there was 11 extra minutes that particular day, because they go from the sun coming up till it goes down, divide it by 12 to get the number of minutes in the hour. And so there's 21 minutes in the hour. Now, the St. George Temple, when it was dedicated on April 6, 1877, you look up the lunar calendar date, and it was the 21st day, the last day of the Passover. So the 21 minutes, 17 minutes, and 33 minutes was the testimony of the temple, the resurrection, and the life of the Savior to me. There's nobody else in the temple would have got that. But it shows you how intimately the Lord knows each one of you, because he knows each of you as much as he knows me, as intimately as that is. And it's just nice to know, after all of these years, that when we die, I wanted to live to be 100 because I was afraid of death. Now I'm ready to go. I'm looking forward to graduating. I'm not going into a bliss of nothingness. There is something for us to do. And I leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.